The hallway was plunged into near silence, broken only by the low sound of a distant clock striking the hour. The lamplight strategically placed along the wall cast elongated shadows that seemed to take on a life of their own. The air was colder than usual, carrying with it that strange sensation only dawn brings, a mixture of calm and tension, as if something about to happen were suspended in the air. From down the hall, the maid emerged with light steps, holding a carefully folded blanket in her arms. The soft fabric exuded the fresh scent of fabric softener, contrasting with the heavy atmosphere of the room. She walked toward the guest room but stopped abruptly when she heard a barely audible sound, the soft click of a door closing. His gaze scanned the hallway, trying to pinpoint the source of the noise. The sound wasn't common at that hour, especially since everyone should already be asleep. The house, large and luxurious, had a habit of breathing on its own at night. Occasional creaks, the wind rustling the windows, but this was different. It was a human sound, intentional. She took 2 more steps and then saw it. The millionaire was leaving a room that she knew very well wasn't his. The scene seemed in slow motion. He carefully pulled the door shut, closing it quietly, and when he turned, he found her standing in the middle of the hallway. Their eyes met for a moment that seemed eternal. He didn't seem surprised to see her there, but there was something in his gaze that conveyed warning, an almost palpable tension. With a slight adjustment of his jacket, he put his hand in his pocket, as if to protect or hide something. The gesture was subtle, but enough to pique her curiosity. Neither of them spoke immediately. They just stared at each other, the silence growing heavier. Finally, he broke the pause. "I was just checking something," he said, his voice low and controlled, filled with neutrality, but with a pause in the middle of the sentence that seemed to betray something unsaid. She nodded automatically, trying to decipher whether that was an excuse or a partial truth. When he started walking toward her, her heart raced. His footsteps were firm, the sound echoing rhythmically on the wooden floor. As he passed her, his expensive, unmistakable perfume mingled with the scent of the blanket she carried. It was then that she noticed a detail. From the side of his jacket pocket, the corner of something was discreetly protruding. Perhaps a piece of paper, perhaps a small ribbon. The color and shape seemed familiar, but her nervous mind couldn't place it at the time. The visual touch of that unintentionally exposed object would remain etched in her memory. When he walked away, she remained motionless for a few seconds, listening to the sound of his footsteps fade to nothing. Then she slowly released the breath she'd been holding, without realizing it. The hallway returned to its usual silence, but nothing felt the same. Now, the space carried a new energy, an invisible weight that would stay with her for the rest of the night. In the guest room, she threw the blanket over the bed and sat for a moment. Questions swirled in her mind. What was he doing in that room? Why did he seem so careful not to be noticed? And most importantly, what was that object hidden in his pocket? His instincts told him the answer wasn't simple, that there was something hidden behind that silent, controlled scene. Maybe a secret, maybe an unspoken confession. And somehow he felt that from that moment on, his role in that house had changed. The next day, the hallway looked different. Sunlight streamed in through the windows, but the memory of the early morning still lingered like a shadow. When she met the millionaire at breakfast, he was serene, chatting about trivial matters. However, when he looked at her, there was a different spark in his eyes, something that immediately reminded her of the scene from the previous night. He smiled, almost imperceptibly, and asked casually, "Did you sleep well?" The question sounded simple, but the way it was phrased carried a subtext. She responded with a quick nod, avoiding prolonged eye contact as she poured the coffee. It was at that moment that he said something that made her breath catch. "Certain things only happen when everyone is asleep." The phrase echoed in his mind. He couldn't tell if it was a provocation or just a random observation, but each word seemed carefully chosen. If you enjoy stories filled with tension, forbidden romance, and twists that keep you hooked from beginning to end, leave a like and subscribe to the channel now. Every detail matters and can completely change the course of the story. That night, When she walked down the same hallway again, the bedroom door was ajar, and on the bed, an object wrapped in carefully folded paper seemed to be waiting for her, as if it were a silent message. As she approached, she noticed there was no name, just a small note tied with tape. For you. In the narrow, windowless hallway with lampshades casting pale halos over the polished floor, she stopped in her tracks as if bumping into her own premonition. The early morning silence wasn't empty. It carried small metals vibrating within the walls, the building's breathing, the hiss of air through cracks. It was in this full silence that the doorknob to room 17 turned slowly, without creaking, as if already knowing the exact time to move. The millionaire emerged through a crack of darkness and light, a trace of shadow slicing across his jacket lapel. His glance was quick, a knife-like stroke measuring the distance of the cut. He swept the hallway, tapped the wall clock, and returned to the door. It wasn't his room. She knew it before she thought, the way one perceives a scent before remembering its name. He closed the door with a light touch, enough so that the click sounded more inside her than in the iron of the lock. He straightened his jacket as if undoing a crease, and with a tiny gesture reached into his inside pocket. He took nothing out. He simply confirmed that something was there, protected by the fabric and the intention. The curve of what was hidden formed a discreet relief. It looked like a small box, perhaps metal, perhaps a key that didn't correspond to any door in that house. His hand slid back down the side of his suit and rested on his hip with the practiced ease of someone always with a plan. He walked, measuring the ground with steps that left no trace. She took a half step back, enough to blend in with the frame of the service door. His heart, however, picked up speed. It beat louder, certain someone needed to hear it. He knew the routine like someone memorizing a prayer. At 2:15, the guard crossed the garden. At 2:20, the heater changed tone. At 2:23, a pipe dilated and crackled. It was 2:22. Time in that hallway had a body, and now a body carried a secret. Room 17 was prepared for guests who never arrived. She herself had changed the sheets there more than once, always by order, always without question. What hurt her wasn't him leaving the room, but the ease with which he'd erased it, as if he wanted the night to forget his existence. The hallway seemed to breathe deeply as he walked away, and she, caught between the impulse to follow him and the fear of becoming part of a story no one would believe, felt her skin tingle. Those who keep things in their pockets keep versions of themselves. He touched the clock, not to check the time, but to ritualize a pause. The reflection of the glass streaked across the wall like a tiny beacon, fading as he moved forward. She tried to remember where she'd seen that same movement of checking the pocket without revealing its contents before. She remembered, in the conference room, when an unexpected visitor uttered a name received as both news and threat. Was the object the same? The little box, the key, the metal that promised to open an invisible door. The overhead light flickered once, not for lack of energy, but as living things do when they want to let you know they're paying attention. He wasn't startled. He smiled at the corner of his mouth, a smile with calculated edges, and quickened his pace slightly, converting the walk into a pause between intention and action. She followed 3 steps behind, protected by the regular creaking of the floor. It wasn't pursuit, it was the surveillance. Of conscience, an intimate tribunal demanding testimony. The corridor, short during the day, stretched out at dawn as if it had found a way to fit more secrets in the same distance. In the distance, the skylight spilled a milky blue of moonlight, cold enough to freeze the most burning doubts. She thought of his wife, of the flowers on Fridays, of the dinners that ended early, as if the house feared the night, so as not to hear confessions. She thought of the staff who knew everything, and therefore knew nothing, because excess becomes noise. She remembered herself of the first night there, when she'd promised not to get more involved than necessary. Promises are fragile when they collide with the magnetism of a truth about to emerge. He turned right toward the marble staircase, where the polished banister bore fingerprints from past parties. With each step, the pocket felt heavier, not because of the object, but because of the meaning it carries when it's in the wrong place, at the wrong time with the person who shouldn't have it. She heard a muffled noise coming from inside his suit, as if something metal were touching a corner. A small thing doesn't make a big noise unless the silence around it is listening. He stopped halfway up the stairs. He looked back. The sharpness of his gaze wasn't trying to erase witnesses. It measured distances, weighed possibilities, calculated how long it would take for a question to be voiced aloud. His right hand touched his pocket. Again, and for a second, his thumb pressed the edge with the delicacy of someone assessing the resistance of a secret. The air grew denser. The wall clock persisted in 2 long ticks, as if the house was slow to accept the next minute. She understood she was facing a frontier. Follow silently, and see how far the truth would go on its own, or cross, with words, and push the truth out of his pocket. His shoes picked up their pace. The hallway became a trail. The trail, a promise. And the promise, danger. They passed the wood-paneled living room, where an old painting always watched her with oily eyes. The curtains slumbered, but the folds held fresh dust. Someone had been there, though no one should have been. He touched the doorknob of the office and hesitated. Hesitation has its own music, a brief chord between wanting and doing. He let go. He continued on. Beside the office, the door to the oratory. The light was on, no one inside. He didn't go in. Perhaps because the things that weigh in the pocket weigh even more under the gaze of a saint. He crossed the hall, skirted the coffee table, and, now out of direct view of the skylight, became a little more shadow than man. She realized the whole house seemed complicit. Everything was working together to let him pass like a purposeful wind. For a moment, she wanted to call his name. But names, when spoken at the wrong moment, turn truths into fabrications. She preferred to keep her voice to herself and widen her eyes. She saw him touch his wedding ring, a brief turn as if reminding his finger of the official story. She saw him once again check the bulge in his pocket. She also saw the detail that would change the meaning of everything. The sleeve of his jacket at the cuff bore a sliver of fabric that didn't belong to him, a soft color reminiscent of new sheets. The entire scene could be summed up in a single verb: to see. She saw the gesture, the object, the path, the intention, the 2 lives that walked, parallel, unsure of when they would collide. She took another step closer, enough to smell his perfume mixed with the cool scent of marble. There was no sweat. There was calculation, and within the calculation, a restrained haste, as if the clock wasn't in charge that night. At the final bend before the kitchen, he stopped again. The pantry sensor flickered on a timid light. He didn't enter. He just rested his fingers against the wood, listening with his skin. Perhaps he was listening for human sounds. Perhaps he wanted someone to stop him without needing to be told. She finally understood that the object in his pocket was less dangerous than the story pushing him. And stories, when pushed, drag entire houses. He continued to the secondary door that led to the inner courtyard, where the night seemed deepest. There, with no apparent witnesses, he reached into his pocket and, only then, lifted the lid of what looked like a small box. He didn't open it completely, just enough for a brief glow to escape and die. He closed it, he put it away, and he remained still as if waiting for a signal beyond his control. She held her breath. She knew that, from that point on, any word would have the power to alter not only what he would do, but what the house would remember tomorrow. The sighting was no accident. It was the visible beginning of something already happening beneath the surface of time. She decided not to blink, and the world, for an instant, seemed to blink for her. And then, the night seemed to lean over them both, as if waiting for a single gesture to change the house's course. Now then, if you were in this hallway, would you walk in silence or call out his name right now? Tell us in the comments the exact second your courage awakens and why you would choose this path. The corridor seemed even narrower when his eyes met hers. There were no words, not a single gesture, just that fixed, heavy gaze, as if he wanted to pierce her soul and discover exactly what she had seen. It was a silent, almost palpable confrontation, as if the air had thickened, and any sharp breath could shatter the fragile balance that existed there. The silence wasn't empty. It was filled with tension, with unasked questions and unanswered answers. The sound of the clock in the background, ticking away each second, sounded like a hammer pounding in her mind, reminding her that this moment, however brief, could change everything. She didn't look away, but her heart raced, not out of fear, but with the knowledge that something was being communicated in that silence, something words couldn't quite express. Each second seemed to stretch as if time were malleable, dragged by the weight of that exchange of glances. She knew he was trying to gauge her reaction, perhaps to gauge how much he could trust her or how much of a threat she might become. There was a chill in the air, but the heat of nervousness burned her skin from within, making her body want to react, but her mind urge calm. He, on the other hand, seemed motionless, with only the slight movement of a muscle in his jaw, as if he were holding something back. Anger, surprise, or a secret too big to escape now. The sound of the clock, distant but constant, marked not just time, but the rhythm of a silent duel between two worlds that met there, in a narrow corridor lit by a yellowish, almost suffocating light. The silence was so intense she could hear her own pulse. He didn't back down, and little by little their exchange of glances stopped being just about what she saw and became about who could resist the most. It was as if every extra second of eye contact was a battle for dominance. She sensed some kind of message there, a warning, a threat, or just a silent plea to forget what she'd seen. And yet no words broke the space between them. Her body, even still, seemed poised for a sudden movement if he made the first move, and he, with that enigmatic air, stood like a statue, yet charged with intention. The sound of the clock grew louder in her mind, almost drowning out other noises. It was as if that ticking were a countdown to something that would inevitably happen. She wondered if she should speak, break the tense spell that had formed, but something inside her told her that any wrong word could change everything, and perhaps not for the better. So she stood her ground, allowing her gaze to be as unwavering as his. Her breathing was measured, her chest rising and falling slowly, while every muscle in her body seemed alert, as if she were on the edge of a cliff, waiting for the first rock to fall. He took a slow, almost imperceptible step, and in that simple movement, something shifted in the air. It wasn't an explicit threat, but it wasn't innocent either. It was a calculated approach, as if he were testing her reaction, the sound of his jacket fabric moving, the slight weight of something in his pocket that he tried to hide, his unblinking gaze. It was all part of a silent game, where every detail mattered. She realized that although words weren't present, his gestures said more than 1,000 sentences could. This was the kind of communication that didn't require sound, only perception. Her mind raced, analyzing his every micro-expression, trying to decipher what lay behind that intense gaze. There was distrust, but also something that could be read as recognition, or even a strange kind of respect. He knew she'd seen something she shouldn't have, and she knew that, from then on, any misstep could put her at risk. The hallway became a stage, and they were the only actors in a scene no one else could fully understand. The walls seemed closer, the air heavier, and the clock continued its relentless ticking. There was no immediate escape, no ready explanation, only that prolonged moment in which everything could change depending on who gave in first. She felt the weight of the choice, to speak or to remain silent, to confront or to retreat. But she knew that silence for now was her best weapon. And in this game, every second that passed only reinforced what was at stake: trust, power, and a secret that could crumble more than walls. Now tell me, if you were in this hallway, faced with this arresting and challenging gaze, would you have the courage to remain silent, or would you speak to release the tension? The air seemed denser at that moment, as if every particle was charged with the tension that had built up. He remained there, motionless, for a few seconds, and when he finally broke the silence, his voice was controlled but charged with a strange neutrality. "I was just checking something," he said unhurriedly, as if weighing each word. However, the pause before speaking was a detail impossible to ignore. There was a space, a void charged with meaning, that seemed to scream louder than any sound. That brief interruption between the moment he was caught and the moment he decided to speak revealed that something was out of place, as if there were more hidden layers behind that improvised explanation. The neutral tone was almost convincing, but it was precisely this attempt at normalcy that betrayed the truth. The absence of overt nervousness didn't mean calm. On the contrary, it was as if he were calculating every movement so as not to let a compromising detail slip. His eyes wouldn't stay with hers for more than 2 seconds, straying to the floor, the wall, anywhere that wouldn't reveal too much. Every gesture seemed rehearsed, as if he'd prepared for that kind of question, but not for that specific moment. She, however, wasn't naive. She knew enough about people to understand that when someone chooses vague words, it's because they don't want to be confronted with the details. Checking something could mean anything, and it's precisely this lack of clarity that sets off internal alarm bells. His body, though firm, betrayed subtle signs. The rigidity of his shoulders, the slight clenching of his jaw, his breathing becoming more pent up. It was as if he were trying to hide the fact that, behind that facade, there was a whirlwind of thoughts and possible defense strategies. The hallway felt colder, not because of the weather, but because of the weight of distrust that permeated the air. The clock in the background continued to tick away, creating an almost hypnotic rhythm, reinforcing the feeling that time was stretching unbearably. She didn't respond immediately. She chose to simply observe him, as if her silence were a magnifying glass capable of revealing cracks in his narrative. And in this silent game, the tension multiplied. There was something almost theatrical in the way he held his posture. The sentence he'd spoken might have been dismissed as irrelevant by anyone distracted by the conversation, but to her, each syllable was a piece of a much larger puzzle. Her mind raced, revisiting the past few days, searching for connections, recalling glances, interrupted conversations, and small inconsistencies that had previously gone unnoticed. It was as if suddenly, everything was part of a hidden plot that was slowly beginning to reveal itself. The silence that followed wasn't one of simple discomfort. It was a charged silence, forcing them both to grapple with the reality that something was about to boil over. He seemed to expect her to accept that justification as sufficient, but he also seemed ready to improvise another if pressed. It was like watching a seasoned gambler maintain calm while holding decisive cards, without revealing whether he's winning or just bluffing. She took a step closer, enough that he felt he couldn't get away with evasions much longer. But instead of questioning him, she held his gaze firmly, letting the weight of the moment do its work. Sometimes the absence of questions is more effective than any interrogation, because silence creates space for the other person's own awareness to become unbearable. And he knew it. His breathing deepened slightly, almost imperceptibly, as if he were adjusting his internal rhythm to avoid showing anxiety. In that moment, it was impossible not to sense that this explanation was merely the surface of something deeper. There was a story hidden between the lines, something that might never be revealed in direct words, but was there, exposed in minimal gestures and calculated pauses. With each passing second, the distance between what he said and what actually happened widened, and that gap became an abyss impossible to ignore. Now tell me, and be honest in the comments, have you ever been faced with someone whose justification sounded perfect, but your gut was screaming that something was wrong? His passage was swift, but to her, each second seemed to stretch out in a slow drag of time. The dim light of the hallway, filtered by a nearly extinguished bulb, slanted over his body for only an instant. But it was enough to reveal a detail that chilled her blood. Something was protruding. From his jacket pocket, a tiny piece of ribbon or paper, perhaps, dangling as if hastily placed there. It didn't appear to have been left in plain sight, but chance is often more revealing than any confession. Her eyes fixed on that detail with the precision of someone who knows they're seeing something important, even without understanding why. The hue was unmistakable, a deep, almost emerald green, with a golden sheen that shimmered in the dim light. She had seen it before. She was sure of it. The memory, however, seemed to play with her mind, dancing on the edge of her consciousness, unable to fully grasp it. She tried to pull at the thread of memory, as if it were an old photograph stored in a dusty box, but the complete image would not form. Her heart raced not only from the mystery, but from the nagging feeling that this symbol or color was connected to something that should not be ignored. He passed her without saying anything, just a curt, almost automatic nod, as if unwilling to prolong the contact. But it was in this restrained gesture that she noticed most, the tension in his shoulders, the way the arm carrying the pocket remained close to his body, as if protecting the contents from any accidental contact. He wasn't just a man walking down the hallway, he was someone guarding something he didn't want seen, and that excessive care screamed louder than any words. Trying not to attract attention, she remained still, but his gaze followed her every step until the shadow swallowed her figure at the end of the hallway. And then came the silence, a silence that was different from before. Now it felt heavy, almost palpable, as if the air were thick with unanswered questions. Her mind returned to recent memories, old books in the house library, a locked box in the office, a stamp on an envelope she had stumbled upon weeks ago. There was always that specific shade of green, a subtle gold, and a symbol that repeated itself on different objects, but whose meaning remained enigmatic. The weight of this association began to increasingly bother her. If it were just a coincidence, why was her body reacting as if it had just stumbled upon the tip of a buried secret? Maybe it was instinct, or maybe it was that sixth sense that warns us that something dangerous is happening right before our eyes. And as much as she tried to rationalize, she knew these signs weren't coming for nothing. She had already learned that details, even the smallest ones, can become gateways to immense and often dark truths. He decided to approach the spot he had passed, not because he expected to find something on the ground, but because he needed to feel the space, absorb any trace that might confirm or deny the burning sensation inside him. The corridor seemed narrower there, the air a little cooler. A faint scent, perhaps of old paper or long-stored fabric, lingered in the air. It wasn't his perfume, but rather a scent that seemed to come from the hidden object itself. As he slowly walked back, the nagging thought that the tape or paper might hold the key to understanding a much larger game began to grow. Perhaps it was connected to events she couldn't yet connect, or perhaps it was just a fragment of something more recent, but one that would have serious implications if revealed. The doubt was almost unbearable, and the worst part was knowing that if she didn't find the answer, that sense of invisible threat would only grow. Now, all she needed to do was put the pieces together. But to do so, she would have to decide whether to follow her instincts, risking discovering something that could change everything, or try to bury the memory, pretending she'd never noticed that suspicious detail. The choice seemed simple, but it carried a weight she couldn't yet fathom. And if you were in her place, with that detail engraved in your mind and the feeling that you are about to discover something that will completely change the way you see certain people, what would you do? The hallway was empty, but the silence that reigned wasn't peaceful but heavy. She remained there, motionless, her body turned in the direction he'd disappeared. The scene replayed in her mind like a movie she couldn't pause. The sound of the door closing, the way he quickly adjusted his pocket as if trying to hide something, and that fleeting look that seemed to convey more than just fatigue. It was too late for visitors to other rooms. The house's routine was rigid, and any movement out of turn drew attention, but what truly bothered her was the feeling that something was deeply wrong in that split second. Time seemed to stretch as she searched within herself for answers, but what she found was a whirlwind of unanswered questions. Why was he in that room? Why had he done it so carefully so as not to be seen? And most importantly, why carry something in his pocket as if it were the most precious or dangerous thing in the world? The details became vivid in her mind. She remembered the way he held his jacket, creating a small barrier between it and the view of any curious onlookers. She also remembered the subtle tension in his shoulders, as if he were ready to react to any threat or question. This wasn't a mere coincidence. She knew that when someone tries to appear natural, it's because they're already aware they're being watched. And he certainly was. The air in the hallway felt colder, or maybe it was just the adrenaline rush still coursing through her. She felt her breathing quicken a little, not because she was afraid, but because doubt had the power to ignite reasoning. It was then that her mind began to involuntarily connect dots. There was something familiar about that defensive posture, something she'd seen before in another situation, though she couldn't recall exactly where. Perhaps in a tense moment at home, or in hushed conversations behind closed doors. Suddenly, she remembered stray comments she'd heard before, phrases that at the time had seemed banal, but now took on a different tone. Certain doors don't open at night. Someone had said that at an informal dinner, half laughing, half serious. At the time, she'd dismissed it, but now that warning sounded like a clue left in the air. That particular room wasn't one she used often. She knew who was staying there and was fully aware there was no legitimate reason for him to be leaving at that hour. And what about what was in his pocket? It could have been just a handkerchief or a personal item, but her instincts screamed that it wasn't something so simple. Instinct, by the way, is a curious thing. It can be ignored 1,000 times, but when it really matters, it doesn't stop speaking. She felt, with an almost painful clarity, that this was no coincidence. Not that night, not in that place. The hallway, lit only by spots of yellow light, seemed longer than usual. She took a step forward, as if to follow his path, but stopped. Part of her wanted to confront him to extract the truth, but another part knew that acting rashly might ruin any chance of finding out what was really going on. So she decided that observation would be more prudent, and perhaps more revealing. She glanced at the bedroom door he had emerged from and felt a shiver run down her spine. If I went in there now, I might find answers, or even more disturbing questions. The echo of his footsteps still felt alive in the air. She closed her eyes for a moment, trying to imagine what he might have been thinking the moment he saw her. He knew he'd been watched, she had no doubt about that, and knowing his mannerisms meant he could change his behavior from then on, becoming more cautious, more evasive. It was a subtle game of invisible moves and counter-moves, and she had just unwittingly entered it. The question was she ready for it? She took a deep breath and leaned against the wall, feeling the cold seeping through her clothes. The sensation was almost like standing before an incomplete puzzle. Pieces were missing, but the outline of the figure was already beginning to form, and with each memory, each detail retrieved, she felt she was closer to understanding. The problem is, sometimes understanding means having to deal with truths no one wants to face, and at that moment, something told her that this truth was much closer than she imagined. Now, tell me, and if it were you, standing in that hallway, watching that scene, would you have the courage to go all the way to find out, or would you rather pretend nothing happened? Breakfast seemed quieter than usual, despite the distant murmur of silverware and cups being arranged by the hurried hands of the staff. The light streamed in through the large windows with a soft golden hue, reflecting off the polished surfaces and giving the room an air of normalcy that, for her, had been lacking. When he entered, the movement around him seemed to slow, as if every detail became clearer. The sound of his breathing, the rhythm of his footsteps, the way his gaze sought and found hers. He was serene, perhaps even more so than the night before, and this disconcerted her. It was as if what had happened were locked away within him, inaccessible to any attempt at superficial reading. But there was something different, a barely perceptible gleam in his eyes, a reflection of something he seemed unwilling to verbalize. He approached calmly, as if it were just another chance encounter between two acquaintances, but she sensed the silent burden that hung between them. The air seemed thicker, the words stuck in their throats, and the only real communication came from that look that said so much without saying anything. When he greeted her, his voice sounded controlled, with the calculated softness of someone measuring each syllable so as not to reveal too much. She responded briefly, trying to even her tone, but she felt her heart race, each beat an insistent reminder that something was off. They sat at the same table, separated only by a distance that seemed insufficient to contain the turmoil she felt. His movements were calm, almost choreographed, pouring the coffee, slowly stirring the spoon, raising the cup to his lips. Nothing, absolutely nothing, indicated that the previous night had existed, except for the fact that, for her, his every gesture carried an echo of that recent memory. The worst part was realizing that perhaps he was enjoying this game of silence, maintaining control of the situation, letting her drown in her own doubts. She tried to focus on the plate in front of her, but his gaze returned every now and then, like an invisible thread tugging at her attention. It wasn't an invasive look, but there was a calculated weight to it, as if each time their eyes met he wanted to make her aware that he was there, watching, gauging her reactions. He didn't ask questions, didn't offer explanations, and this lack of justification was even more disturbing than any evasive answer could have been. With every passing second, the forced normalcy of that morning transformed into a kind of silent tension. Around them, side conversations filled the space, but none of them reached them. It was as if they were isolated in a bubble inhabited only by the two of them. The sound of silverware and plates couldn't break through the invisible field surrounding the table. And yet, she sensed he didn't simply want to ignore what had happened. On the contrary, he seemed to feed on this suspension, this gap between fact and explanation, as if he knew her curiosity was growing by the minute. When he finally said something about the weather, it was almost banal, but the way he said it, pausing slightly before completing the sentence, made it all sound like it had a double meaning that only she seemed to notice. He smiled quietly, as if he were guarding a valuable piece of information. It was impossible to tell if the gleam in his eyes reflected satisfaction at having maintained control, or if it concealed a concern he didn't want to admit. The time at the table seemed to stretch. With each exchange of words, with each strategic silence, she felt she was faced with a riddle, and not just a man. Part of her wanted to confront him right then and there, to extract answers, but another part feared discovering a truth that could change everything. He, for his part, seemed comfortable in this ambiguous terrain, as if he knew that doubt was his greatest weapon at that moment. The moment he finished his coffee and put down the cup, the sound was almost symbolic, like the full stop of a sentence that hadn't yet been written. He stood up as calmly as he had arrived, leaving behind not only the aroma of freshly brewed coffee, but a string of unanswered questions. As he left, he gave her one last look that, instead of closing the subject, reopened it completely, as if to say, without words, that this was far from over. Now tell me, if it were, would you have the courage to ask what really happened, or would you prefer to carry this mystery, imagining what could be behind that look? The atmosphere seemed suspended in mid-air, as if every movement were being watched by invisible eyes. The distant murmur of the street contrasted with the tense silence of the dining room. She was there, settling into her chair, her face still slightly marked by the pillow, trying to find some ease in their first encounter of the day. He appears, walking with firm but unhurried steps, as if every second of his approach was calculated. His eyes fix on her before he even reaches the table, and there's something in that look that carries more than simple morning cordiality. Without ceremony, he leans slightly to the side as if invading an intimate space, and asks in a low, almost soft voice if she had slept well. The tone, though polite, carried a different weight. It wasn't the typical polite question. There was a restrained curiosity, almost as if the answer were more important than it seemed at first glance. Surprised by his proximity and the way he held her gaze, she responds briefly, but her mind begins to race. As he sits down, he maintains that constant presence, not rushing to move the coffee or cutlery, as if his every gesture were part of a silent performance. When he decides to pour the coffee, he doesn't do it mechanically. Instead, he holds the carafe calmly, and as he tilts the hot liquid over the cup, blurts out a phrase that shatters any attempt at normality. Certain things only happen when everyone is asleep. The words echo in the air, not because of their volume, but because of the enigma they carry. She holds the cup, but feels the slight tremor of someone who's just heard something they're unsure whether they should have said. His tone wasn't joking, or an explicit confession, but a calculated insinuation, and that was exactly what made everything so uncomfortable. Her mind begins to conjure up Scenarios, vague images of dark hallways, doors slowly closing, restrained footsteps in the early morning. What if he knew she'd also been awake that night, observing more than she should have? There was a game going on here, and he seemed to know exactly which cards to play. The silence that follows isn't casual. It's filled with an invisible field of mutual attention. She realizes he's not distracted by the newspaper beside him or his own plate. His eyes, even when they stray, return to hers, as if to gauge every reaction, every deep breath. His seemingly stray sentence lingers in her mind like an insistent shadow. Certain things. What exactly did he mean? Was it a warning, a provocation, or simply a way of probing how much she knows? The aroma of coffee seems stronger, perhaps due to the tension lingering over the table. He stirs the sugar with slow, unhurried movements, creating an almost hypnotic cadence. The sound of the spoon lightly hitting the porcelain reinforces the contrast. With the weight of the words that still echo, she feels that if she presses on the subject, she might open a door to something she might not be ready to hear. But at the same time, ignoring it feels like allowing him to maintain control of the narrative. And that's exactly what he seems to want, to maintain the role of someone who has something more to reveal, but only when he sees fit. She realizes the conversation is drifting in a trivial direction, as if he's dropped his insinuating tone and returned to a casual tone. He talks about the weather, about coffee, about a date later. But it's impossible to ignore that, behind these common words, there's a hidden intention. He seems to be testing how well she can maintain her composure in the face of an invisible tension. And the more he remains calm, the more she feels herself being pulled into a territory of uncertainty, where every detail could be a sign or a trap. Deep down, she knows this morning isn't just another morning. There's something different about the way he approaches her, the way he manages his time and attention. The personal tone, the ambiguous phrasing, and the way he conducts the interaction show that, even without direct statements, he's already established a level playing field. And if she wants to understand what "when everyone else is asleep" really means, she'll need to be willing to face what she might not want to see. Now tell me, if you were in her shoes, would you keep the conversation safe or risk asking what he really meant? She walked slowly down the narrow hallway, her mind still unsettled by what she had witnessed earlier. The muffled sound of her own footsteps seemed to echo alongside the memories of that scene that kept replaying in her head. His quick glance, his hand tucked into his pocket, the almost imperceptible gesture of hiding something. It was as if the air around her carried an invisible weight, something whispering truths she wasn't yet ready to hear. Then, a detail on the floor, almost unnoticed, interrupted her train of thoughts. A small package lying near the door of a room that wasn't his reflected the dim light of the lamp. The color, exactly the same as the one she had seen escaping from his pocket that silent night. Her heart raced, and a chill ran down her spine. She bent down to pick it up, feeling the smooth texture between her fingers. It was light, but there was a strange density inside, as if it held something valuable. The seal was broken, but still firm enough to suggest it had been opened only once. Unfolding the small flap of paper, she found inside a delicate object, wrapped in a thin, soft fabric. There was no card, no note, no identification. Just this intimate gift, the nature of which spoke more than any words could. She held it in her hands, trying to process its meaning. The lack of an explicit recipient made everything more disturbing and, at the same time, more revealing. If it was something ordinary, anyone could have dropped it and come back for it later. But no, there was care in the wrapping, a specific choice of color and material. It wasn't a coincidence. It wasn't something anyone would take with them without reason. In that moment, fragmented memories began to align like puzzle pieces. The way he'd looked at her days ago, the tension in their conversations, the silences that seemed to carry secrets. Everything pointed to something she couldn't yet define, but which certainly wasn't innocent. Holding that small package, she realized she was faced with a puzzle that blended affection and mystery, closeness and distance. The gift didn't say who it was for, but it said a lot about the person carrying it. It was too intimate to be given without a specific purpose. The packaging seemed almost like a veiled invitation, a promise one dared not declare aloud. But then the burning question arose. If the gift wasn't for her, who was it for? And why did it have to be hidden like that? The hallway was empty, but the atmosphere felt alive, as if the walls had memorized every step, every exchange of glances. She wondered if she should keep it as silent proof, confront him, or simply return it, and pretend nothing had happened. But deep down, she knew any action she took could trigger consequences she wasn't ready to face. At the same time, something inside her burned with the need to know the truth. As she held the package, she realized it wasn't just the object that weighed heavily in her hands, but what it represented: hidden intentions, undeclared relationships, secrets carefully kept hidden from the light. It was as if that small package were the key to a door she wasn't sure she wanted to open, but which, somehow, was already ajar. Now I ask you, if you were in her place, with this silent proof in your hands, and a whirlwind of questions in your mind, what would you do? Would you keep it to yourself, or would you go all the way to discover the truth? Night fell thickly over the house, swallowing the hallways and muffling the voices. She returned to the same hallway as yesterday, guided by a magnet of courage and fear that would not rest. The ancient floorboards recognized her footsteps, but creaked less, perhaps from the cold, perhaps because she stepped as if carrying a full glass. The bedroom door was ajar, exuding a warm glow, a thread of day trapped in the dawn. The silence was thickly woven. With her fingertips, she pushed the wood open enough to fit. Through the gap, first she saw the bed, then the wrapping, lastly the note. On the impeccable bedspread lay the gift that had existed only as a suspicion the day before. The narrow ribbon remained intact, the bow straight, and the paper had a subtle shine. Beneath it a card read, in firm letters, "For you." The phrase, so short, pierced her. For you. Who would write this after the averted glances, the hidden object, the unlikely excuse, the ambiguous approach at the cafe? Who would transform? Doubt into gesture, shadow into word. She closed her hand to contain the tremor and took a step. The lampshade cast a warm light over the bed. The circle held the gift, the note, and her breath. On the small table, a fountain pen rested on a small tray, as if someone had just written. The ink glistened. She held the note up to the light, looking for pressure marks, trying to guess if the hand was steady. The card was clean, the handwriting steady. Then a light sound trod the hallway. It wasn't exactly a footstep. It was a careful shuffle, the sound of someone wanting to exist unnoticed. Her body reacted. It took a half step back and left the rectangle of light. The noise stopped. The house creaked, the clock persisted, and a distant window rattled in the wind. In the interval, her heart lengthened the minute. She looked back at the gift. The precise bond disturbed her. No one rushes a bond like that. Those who do it with attention. Attention demands intention. Intention gives a name to movements that feign chance. Retracing her steps, she lined up the pieces, the sighting in the hallway, his quick glance, the object in his jacket, the phrase in the coffee, the ribbon slipping from his pocket, and now this. Isolated details, together a clear shadow of history. But stories carry folds. What if it wasn't his? What if someone planted signs to fabricate her in a labyrinth? What if the gift were a trap, and the note, a key that opens doors of no return? A chill that wasn't. The climate's feeling crept up the back of her neck. She inhaled, held it, let her reason flow before deciding what to do with her hands. Touched the paper, handmade texture, fiber reminiscent of stored books. Almost no perfume, calculated neutrality. She turned the card over. Nothing on the back. Simple vertical handwriting like someone training themselves not to tremble. She imagined the scene. Pen poised, brief note, the decision to stop at the second word so as not to turn care into confession. In the doorframe, the light traced an arc. To cross it would be to enter into decision, retreat, prolong the doubt. Doubt preserves versions. Decision makes time pass. She slid her thumb under the ribbon. The loop remained intact, obedient, ready to give at the right point. She realized she wasn't alone. Consequences keep company. Decisions pull tides. And there was the most uncomfortable question. Why for you and not a name? A sign of care, a game, or the certainty that she would recognize the authorship even without a signature? A breath passed through the leaning window, moved the curtain and made the ribbon tremble. The small gesture seemed like a signal. She lifted the package 2 fingers above the bedspread to feel its weight. Light, but not hollow. Perhaps fabric, perhaps paper wrapped around something soft, perhaps a small metal hidden in softness. Scenarios crossed. Apology, invitation, provocation, sweet threat. Each hypothesis wrote a different ending. Within reach. And she understood. The center was not the object, but the courage to choose without guarantees. The light flickered, and she couldn't tell if it was from the net or hers. The clock moved forward a second, weighing like a minute. The house held its breath with her. She set the gift down, aligned it with the edge of the note as if marking boundaries, and walked to the threshold. She stopped there, where inside and outside touched. If she opened it now, she would reveal something to herself that she might not be able to hide later. If she waited, she risked seeing the gesture turn to noise. In the distance, the dragging returned, faint, almost a memory. This time it brought measure, not fear. She wasn't running from someone. She was negotiating with fate. She leaned over the bed, gathered the note between her fingers, and read it a third time. For you. The third reading sounded definitive. She put the card in her pocket and walked 2 steps outside, leaving the gift where it was. The hallway grew long again, but it wasn't the same. Neither was she. Something had reorganized the house from within. At the corner of the hallway, she glanced over her shoulder and saw again the ribbon shimmering faintly in the light. In that tiny space, an entire promise could fit. If you were in that hallway, would you open the gift now or wait until morning? Tell us in the comments how you would protect what matters without stifling the courage to take a risk.